Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. Fate is defined as the development of events beyond a person's control. So in this video, we're going to look at 4 individuals who through no fault of their own were victims of extremely strange and disturbing simple acts of fate. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The 9th century in the North Atlantic was an age of warbands and sea kings where power wasn't earned, it was taken. Across Norway, King Harald Fairhair had unified the land through brutal conquest, but victory came at a cost. His heavy taxation and consolidation of power drove many lesser lords into exile, sailing westwards across the sea in search of freedom and new land. These Norse exiles would make their way to the Scottish islands of Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides Islands before launching raids into the Scottish mainland. However, still determined to bring them under his command, Harold launched a fierce campaign around 875, retaking the islands in bloody battle. In the aftermath, he rewarded his loyal Jarl Ronvald I Steinson with lordship over Orkney and Shetland. He would then pass this lordship to his brother Sigurd I Steinson, who was a warrior whose ambition matched his ruthlessness, and Sigurd immediately seized the opportunity. As Earl of Orkney, he both fortified his rule and expanded relentlessly, forging alliances and launching raids deep into Scotland. For nearly 20 years, Sigurd's power grew and he became one of the most feared warlords of his age. Even at the height of this power though, his conquest was not without resistance. The land was far from empty. It belonged to chieftains, clans, and warriors who had defended it long before the longships ever arrived on their shores. And among these who refused to bow was a man named Malbright. While the details of his life are obscured by time, legend remembers him clearly as a Pictish or Gaelic chieftain who ruled near what is now Inverness. He was also known as a man with a striking feature that earned him an unforgettable nickname, Malbright the Bucktoothed. His land was also strategically vital, lying directly in the path of Sigurd's growing ambitions. And as Sigurd pressed deeper into Scotland, his raids became more aggressive and his incursions more frequent. Malbright had soon watched long enough, and eventually the two men's worlds collided. Tensions escalated into the threat of open war, and rather than subject their forces to a prolonged campaign of bloodshed, Malbright proposed an honorable battle of 40 men on each side. No armies, no surprise attacks, just warrior against warrior in the old way. Sigurd agreed to this, and it should have been a moment of mutual respect and an attempt to avoid senseless slaughter while settling a bitter conflict. But Sigurd had no intention of playing fair. When the time came for the confrontation, he would bring 80 men, not 40, and disguise the deception by having each pair of warriors ride together on one horse. Malbright, meanwhile, kept his word, but as the two parties approached the battlefield, the deception quickly unraveled. Malbright spotted something wrong, and his famous line, supposedly spoken to his men before the battle, has survived the centuries. It was, quote, "Sigurd has made fools of us. I can see 2 men's legs on the flanks of each horse." It was too late to retreat though. Malbright and his men had been betrayed, outnumbered 2 to 1 in open ground, but they still stood and fought. The Pictish warriors then clashed with the Norse invaders in a desperate attempt to defend their homeland, but against superior numbers and coordinated tactics, they were overwhelmed. What followed was a slaughter. Malbright was killed along with the entirety of his 40-man company. Sigurd stood victorious, his enemies cut down, their leader beheaded, and with Malbright gone and his men wiped out, Sigurd had removed the final obstacle to his dominance over the north. In the aftermath, the Norse warriors also took grisly trophies from the dead, and the heads of the fallen Picts were severed and tied to the saddles. Among them was Malbright's, with his infamous tooth still jutting out from his mouth, even in death. And Sigurd, riding at the head of the pack, had Malbright's head tied to his own saddle. It swung beside him as he traveled back toward his homeland. This wasn't unusual for the time. Viking warriors often used the bodies of the fallen to send messages, and yet, during this moment, Sigurd's fate shifted. Malbright's head, jostled by the horse's movement, began to swing violently, and with each stride, the protruding tooth scraped against Sigurd's exposed leg. It wasn't much, just a small graze on the calf, but it drew blood. As Sigurd returned home, the dull ache in his leg began to pulse. Soon, pain began to flare behind the calf muscle and heat radiated from the wound before fever set in. The proud Earl may not have shown it at first. Maybe he tried to walk it off or ride through it, unwilling to display weakness before his men. In the days that followed though, the man who had taken vast swaths of land by force was reduced to a sweating, shivering figure, powerless to halt the toxins moving through his blood. And it all traced back to that one moment when an enemy's tooth scraped against his leg. Sigurd the Mighty, one of the most powerful Viking warlords of his age, died in bed, sweating, delirious, and helpless against the creep of infection. The wound on his leg had festered beyond saving, and blood poisoning, or what we now know as sepsis, coursed through his body. For all his experience in battle, there was no defense against it. He would die sometime around the year 892 after nearly 2 decades of rule, and his burial place, if it was ever marked, has long since vanished. As Frank Hayes got dressed on June 4th, 1923, he could barely believe the opportunity he suddenly had in front of him. Frank was only 22 years old, but he was a longtime stable boy and horse trainer, and he had always dreamed of the day he would one day suit up in his racing silks and climb atop a horse as a jockey, and that dream was finally about to come true. After he strapped his helmet underneath his chin, he placed a foot in the stirrups of a horse named Sweet Kiss before throwing his other leg over the horse and settling into the saddle. In moments, he'd be guiding the 20-to-1 long-shot horse down the track in a steeplechase race at the fabled Belmont Park in New York. A steeplechase is a distance race where horses have to leap over fences and ditches on their way to the finish line, and although Sweet Kiss was projected to cross that line well behind the other favorites in the race, Frank was no less excited about it. The horses were then loaded into the starting gate one by one, and when the final horse was in the last stall, the front doors flung open to signal the start of the race. The crowd began to cheer as the horses rounded the track and leapt over the various obstacles in the way. As they came down the stretch, though, something completely unexpected happened that brought the crowd to their feet. Among the leaders was Sweet Kiss. Then when the horses were just a gallop or two from the finish line, Sweet Kiss and Frank separated themselves from the other participants just enough to cross it first and winning by a head. The crowd then stood and cheered in disbelief because although it certainly wasn't the first time a horse with long odds took first place at Belmont, Frank was so well known and liked around the track that for a brief moment money didn't matter to the onlookers. As the crowd cheered, Sweet Kiss continued to gallop for about 100 yards before letting up and coming to a stop. When she did though, spectators saw Frank slump forward before sliding down the side of the horse to the ground. The crowd then suddenly hushed as Frank laid face down on the track, not moving. It was immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. Dr. John Voorhees, the track physician, then ran out to Frank and rolled him over. He hoped that Frank had just been overcome by the excitement of winning his first race, and while the doctor may have been correct, the extent of Frank's overwhelm wasn't clear until Dr. Voorhees couldn't find a pulse. The 22-year-old first-time jockey was dead. It would take some time to piece together what happened that day at Belmont Park, but Frank's cause of death was ruled a heart attack. Some would speculate that it was the excitement of his first race that caused his heart to give out, but the facts of the lead-up to the race would tell a much different story. Frank did have dreams of one day being a jockey, and many would-be jockeys earned that opportunity the same way Frank did, by working the stables and training horses. After Frank pestered his employer for quite a while to allow him to ride during a race, his employer eventually relented, but only on the condition that Frank cut some of his body weight. If you're not familiar with horse racing, it might not immediately be apparent that weight is such a crucial factor in the sport, but in fact, every pound actually matters a lot. A lighter jockey places less strain on the horse, allowing it to run faster and more efficiently. In order for Frank to be given the opportunity to ride, he'd have to get down to 130 pounds or 59 kilograms by race day. The problem was Frank weighed 142 pounds or 64 kilograms just 24 hours before the race at Belmont. He then immediately began denying himself food and water while pushing through an intensive exercise regimen. It was said that he lifted weights, jogged, and twisted his body into contortions, all in a desperate effort to strip away the final pounds that would allow him to race on June 4th. Such extreme measures weren't uncommon in the sport, where maintaining a competitive weight often required relentless sacrifice, but for Frank, it may have proven fatal. When he climbed into the saddle that day, more than a handful of track workers noticed that he was pale and visibly exhausted. After the gate swung open, with each stride drawing the horse and rider closer to the finish line, Frank's heart likely pounded from the adrenaline rush, and then it failed. As Sweet Kiss raced toward the finish line, Frank remained upright in the saddle, his body still locked in position. Only well after the mare crossed the finish line did anything appear to be out of the ordinary. And more than 100 years have passed since the race, but it's still unclear when exactly Frank's heart gave out. Although photographers of that period were not used to shooting steeplechase races, one managed to get a shot of Frank and Sweet Kiss mid-jump over one of the obstacles, with Frank looking very much still alive. He was remembered as a kind and hard-working man who was popular among his fellow stable-hands. Sadly, Sweet Kiss never raced again, and according to the lore, the incident earned her the nickname Sweet Kiss of Death. Frank still holds a unique place in the record books as the only dead jockey to ever win a horse race. Clement Laird Vallandigham was born on July 20, 1820 in Lisbon, Ohio. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and from a young age, Clement had a taste for boldness, big ideas, and eventually bigger fights. Instead of attending law school, he took the traditional route of studying under his older brother, eventually gaining admission to the Ohio bar in 1842. It didn't take long before Clement relocated to Dayton, where he built a thriving law practice. As a lawyer, he was sharp, persuasive, and most of all relentless, traits that would serve him well in courtrooms and eventually political chambers alike. Because the law alone wasn't quite enough for him, and so he set his eyes on bigger stages. He was drawn to politics, and he ran for Congress not once, not twice, but 3 times before finally clawing his way into a seat. By the time the country began to crack on the way to civil war, Clement was already a household name in Ohio and a national lightning rod. He was a fierce opponent of Lincoln and a leading voice of the Peace Democrats, and his fiery speeches against the war eventually led to his arrest. Instead of imprisoning him, though, Lincoln banished him to the Confederacy, which in an ironic twist of fate didn't want him either. So with his political career thoroughly flamed out, he returned to the place where he started, which was the courtroom, defending clients and winning cases, but also still stirring up controversy. On Christmas Eve, 1869, the American Saloon in Hamilton, Ohio was buzzing. Upstairs in a private gambling room, a man named Thomas Myers was in the middle of a game when 5 men burst into the room, including another man named Thomas McGeehan. McGeehan was known to carry a chip on his shoulder and a serious grudge against Myers. What happened next is murky, as some said McGeehan came in ready to fight, while others said that Myers made the first move, but regardless, by the end of the scuffle, Myers was dead, gun in hand, slumped on the floor with a bullet in his body and 2 more rounds fired off in a panic. In the aftermath, as is often the case, the town didn't need much convincing. In the court of public opinion, McGeehan was guilty before the body was even cold. It didn't help that one of the intruders claimed that McGeehan had fired through the pocket of his overcoat and later showed him the bullet hole in the fabric, but Clement wasn't buying this story. By the time the case came to trial in June of 1871, Clement had pored over the testimonies and zeroed in on something everyone else had missed or ignored, which is the bullet hole, or rather the lack of one. His client's coat didn't have the hole that one of the intruders claimed it did. If McGeehan had fired through it, there should have been a clear mark, but there wasn't. This led Clement to an interesting theory. What if Myers had accidentally done it to himself? In the chaos of the fight while fumbling for his gun, what if he had accidentally discharged the weapon into his own body? Witnesses said that Myers had been pulling the pistol from his pocket when the first shot rang out, so could that have been the fatal mistake? Clement thought so, and in true fashion, words alone wouldn't cut it. He wanted to show the jury, not just tell them. By Friday, June 16, 1871, the murder trial was winding down. The prosecution had rested its case, and Clement was preparing for his final argument. Earlier that day, Clement and members of the defense team slipped away to the outskirts of Lebanon, Ohio, and armed with a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, the same model believed to have killed Myers, they fired into pieces of cloth at varying distances, studying the gunpowder marks. The goal was to demonstrate how much residue a shot left when fired up close to bolster Clement's theory. Afterward, as the group returned to the Golden Lamb Hotel, Clement was ready. The evidence as he saw it supported his belief. He brought the pistol, still loaded with 3 rounds, back to his room and laid it beside another identical weapon, which was unloaded and meant for court demonstration purposes. Then later that night, while conferring with members of the defense team once again, Clement decided to run through one last rehearsal. His plan was to recreate the exact movement he believed Myers had made in the final seconds of his life. So Clement picked up what he thought was the unloaded revolver and slipped it into his right trouser pocket. Then, as if slipping into character in front of the jury, Clement announced that this was the way Myers had his pistol in his pocket. He then drew the pistol upwards, slow and deliberate, keeping the muzzle close to his body, just as Myers would have. Then, with dramatic emphasis, he pulled the trigger, and to everyone's surprise, there was a flash and a muffled pop. Clement then staggered back, clutching his abdomen. The bullet had torn through his stomach, lodging somewhere near his bladder. He had mistakenly grabbed the wrong gun. 2 doctors staying at the hotel did what they could to keep Clement stable, and he remained calm and even lucid. In the beginning, he spoke clearly and believed he'd survive. His only son Charles arrived with another doctor soon and got a chance to speak with his father, who remained upbeat. By dawn, however, that optimism began to slip away, and at 9:42 a.m., Clement passed away in the very room he'd sealed his own fate. His demonstration was so successful that it cost him his own life, but it also brought his client's freedom. McGeehan would go on to be acquitted in the death of Myers. 73-year-old Arturo had always been a man of calm strength. He was a Baptist minister living on Hawaii's Big Island, and he was known for his gentle demeanor and a life that revolved around faith, family, and community. He spoke mostly Spanish and lived a modest existence, but his presence was the kind that filled a room, and that's part of the reason why his congregation adored him so much. But unfortunately, by the year 2000, that presence was starting to fade a bit. Arturo had been suffering from worsening lower back pain, and it wasn't just a matter of discomfort. Over the course of 6 months, his condition had sharply deteriorated. What began as stiffness and fatigue grew into something much more serious, a condition known as progressive paraparesis, or partial paralysis of the lower limbs. His ability to walk was then slipping away. Bladder control also became erratic as he lived with co-occurring conditions known as spinal stenosis and degenerative spondylolisthesis. And these conditions were eventually robbing him of his independence piece by piece. So desperate for relief, Arturo was referred to a neurosurgeon at Hilo Medical Center. The surgeon then reviewed the case and concluded that Arturo would likely benefit from a lumbar laminectomy and spinal fusion. This is a procedure meant to decompress the spine and stabilize it using metal rods and screws. And it wasn't an unusual recommendation, and for someone in Arturo's state, it sounded like a lifeline. So happily, Arturo signed the paperwork and put his faith in the system, believing he was just one procedure away from regaining a life that had slowly been stolen from him. On the morning of January 29, 2001, Arturo was admitted to Hilo Medical Center. He was then prepped, sedated, and wheeled into surgery, hoping that in just a few hours his back would be stabilized and his suffering would be eased. He was in the hands of a board-certified neurosurgeon after all. What could go wrong? For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. The surgeon performed the lumbar laminectomy without incident, carefully removing pressure from Arturo's spinal cord. The 2 initial pedicle screws were then placed precisely where they needed to go, and by all accounts it was shaping up to be a textbook spinal fusion. However, when the surgeon asked for the titanium rod that would connect the screws and stabilize Arturo's spine, she froze. It was missing, and it was soon realized that it hadn't just been misplaced, it was gone. Somehow, the surgical kit was incomplete, and if the surgeon wanted to finish the job right away, he'd have to wait. Replacement rods just didn't exist in storeroom shelves, and the closest available set was on another island, meaning it would be a few hours before they arrived. By then, Arturo would have been under anesthesia for nearly 5 hours, which was longer than the surgeon was comfortable with. And so, staring down at an unconscious patient with an open surgical wound, he made a choice. There on the surgical tray, he spotted a stainless steel screwdriver. It was part of the instrument set that was just for tool work, but to the surgeon it looked close enough to the titanium rod he was supposed to implant into Arturo. The shaft was the same diameter as what was needed to complete the surgery, and he was running out of time, so the surgeon reached for a hacksaw. Right there in the operating room, with his patient under sedation and his team stunned, he sawed off a 3-centimeter section of that screwdriver shaft and then implanted it into Arturo's spine. According to the surgeon, he announced this plan to the surgical team and assured everyone that it was in his patient's best interest. He claimed he also explained the situation to Arturo's family later that night too, framing it as a necessary improvisation. Other reports, however, tell a different story, one in which no one outside that operating room had any idea what he had just done. And so the end result was that there were no titanium rods and no FDA-approved medical implants, just a chunk of metal not designed to be inside the human body. The screwdriver was an unapproved, untested substitute with unknown consequences, and stainless steel versus titanium isn't just a question of durability. It's also a question of biocompatibility, safety, and longevity, and the surgeon had gambled on all of it. In his own words though, keeping Arturo under anesthesia with an unstable spine for 2 more hours was the greater risk, but in the end, the risk he chose would prove to be far worse. But at first, there wasn't really a sign of what lay ahead. Arturo came out of the surgery groggy but alive. No one told him what had really been implanted into his back. No one mentioned screwdrivers or hacksaws. The hope, it seemed, was that the makeshift solution would quietly do its job until it could be replaced. But 3 days later, everything came crashing down. It was just a simple fall that Arturo suffered, but when your spine is being held together by a piece of metal never meant to bear the body's weight, a simple fall is all it takes to break everything. The screwdriver implant snapped, fracturing into pieces. This resulted in a second surgery being performed the next morning. This time a proper titanium rod was inserted, but by then the damage was done. Arturo had gone from man seeking relief to one permanently paralyzed. The fall that broke the screwdriver in his back triggered a cascade of complications. And over the next 2 years, Arturo would undergo 3 additional surgeries in an attempt to repair the surgical and neurological damage. None of them restored what Arturo had lost though. Instead, he became a paraplegic, incontinent, and bedridden, and his independence was gone, and he was now entirely dependent on the care of his sister. The man who had once delivered sermons, who had offered hope and comfort to others, now needed help just to sit up in bed. His condition then continued to worsen until on June 18, 2003, Arturo passed away at the age of 76. The official cause of death wasn't the screwdriver, but it's believed it directly contributed to his sharp decline. His quality of life had also been stolen, and his body never truly recovered. And neither did his family, obviously, but what they didn't know just yet was how deep the betrayal really ran. Because it wasn't just a single botched surgery, it was part of a pattern. In the aftermath, Arturo's family rightfully had questions after his death. His recovery hadn't just gone poorly, it had gone disastrously. They knew something wasn't right, but the truth didn't come from a doctor's mouth or even a hospital report. It came from the garbage. After the surgery to remove the broken screwdriver shaft, nurses retrieved the metal fragments from the garbage where the surgeon had disposed of them. And thankfully, the nurses didn't keep quiet. Instead, they brought the pieces to a lawyer and told Arturo's family what had really been inside his back. And shortly after, as the family began digging into the surgeon's background, what they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. Before Arturo was ever wheeled into that operating room, the surgeon had already left a trail of destroyed lives across multiple states. His medical license had been suspended in Oklahoma and revoked altogether in Texas. There were also at least 7 malpractice suits filed against him prior to Arturo's surgery. One of them involved a woman in Oklahoma who had gone in for a routine operation on a ruptured disc. The surgeon allegedly operated on her while under the influence of narcotics, and the result was her leaving the hospital in adult diapers and only being able to walk with a walker. A court would eventually award her $1.3 million for her pain and suffering. It was also discovered, according to medical board documents, that the surgeon had allegedly developed a narcotics addiction from self-medicating chronic lower back pain. He had even admitted to writing fake prescriptions to feed that addiction. And this was all on record. It was documented in board files, and somehow none of that had stopped him from practicing surgery at Gila Medical Center in Hawaii. The hospital had granted him privileges, and the state had given him a license. He had somehow been fully authorized to take a hacksaw to a screwdriver and shove it into someone's spine. When the full truth came to light, the outrage wasn't just about what the surgeon had done, it was about how it had been allowed to happen. How does a man with a revoked medical license in one state, a suspension in another, and a trail of malpractice suits still find himself in an operating room? Apparently, despite everything on record, the surgeon was licensed to practice medicine in the state of Hawaii. When Arturo's family finally sued Hilo Medical Center for credentialing a known danger, the hospital stood firm. Legally, they claimed their hands were clean, but thankfully, a circuit court jury didn't see it that way. The jury decided that not only was the surgeon negligent, but so was the hospital that let him through the door in the first place. Arturo's family would eventually receive $5.6 million for that negligence. The surgeon's medical license was then finally revoked in Hawaii, and he packed up and moved to Kansas, where he attempted to apply for a new license. Fortunately, someone in Kansas saw the red flags and waved him off the field. He eventually withdrew his application, and he is no longer legally allowed to practice medicine anywhere in the United States, but the damage had already been done. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.